Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending where you're at in the country. It's noon out here on the East Coast. I know we got some folks on the West Coast, a little bit earlier for you. And then my wonderful guest today is also coming in from I don't even know, Chris, what time it is in Arizona anymore, since you guys decide sometimes to have daylight savings and sometimes you don't. So what do you
Well,
got?
we decided that we want to connect with Denver and the mountain region now. We're tired of the Pacific West Coast, so we're connecting with the mountain region.
Mountain time, so 10 a.m. your time. And so this is our, I think, third all access event that we've done. For those of you that are just joining us for the first time, kind of the point of these brief educational, hopefully, calls are to talk a little bit about what's been going on at WZ from a curriculum standpoint. We've had a ton of changes the last couple of years. We want to make sure you're informed. But also, and importantly, is to create just an open platform. If anybody has questions, if your team is coming out to our classes and you're hearing different things than from what you remember learning, if you're hearing things in the interview kind of interrogation industry and you want to know what our thoughts are on it, or maybe it's something that we haven't even thought of and you guys have some questions or tips for us so we can incorporate into our training. And so it's been really exciting the last couple of times we've done this. We do have some questions that have come in from all of you listening for the last couple of times. But also those of you listening right now on YouTube, and I see we got quite a few people that are watching us live. Some of you I know are probably going to be watching this recorded, but morning to all of you. Morning, Sonia up in Buffalo area, and Chris up in Vegas, Mike up in Toronto, Joe Davis, good to see you. So a lot of good friends of the program on, but this platform's for you. So if any of you guys have questions, you've got myself, so Dave Thompson. You also today have Chris Norris, our director of our international training and webinar training for WZ, who's got a ton of experience as obviously a well-known WZ instructor, helps to kind of develop a lot of our curriculum, and has done a really good job of integrating all of our curriculum into the international space. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for hanging out with me today.
Anytime, Dave. My pleasure, and my pleasure to be with out there live. And again, as Dave said, feel free, guys, if you got a question that we're not addressing today that is already that's already been sent in to us, if we haven't hit it for you, feel free. We're happy to help out.
So I was looking at our questions this morning, and of course, about 5 minutes before the call, I get a question that comes in from I'll just use Doug as the name, so I'm not gonna give any more details away. But the question was, how did the Bills lose to the Jets yesterday? So how dare somebody wants to kick off my Monday with
that's a reasonable question to ask, Dave.
Yes, I know, I understand. So I'm still recovering, but we'll move past that. But from an interview standpoint, one question that came up, and I've got a PowerPoint I'll share up to remind us of what we're talking about, because between Chris and I, we can probably get off script a little bit. But one of the first questions that has actually been pretty constant in the last year or so is this concept of what is the issue with, and I put in quotes, lying about evidence. In the last about 18 months, there's been some legislation across the United States specifically focused on this tactic. So I thought it'd be relevant to talk a little bit about here. If you do have some time and you go back to on our YouTube page, we actually have a video where we specifically talked about the benefits of some of this legislation, but just real high level, as most investigators in the US are aware, in 1969, there was a Supreme Court law, Frazier versus Cupp, that allows investigators to lie about evidence. Chris, I know, and you can speak to some of this, but when we teach an international audience, most people think that's crazy in the first place.
Most people do, yeah. And in most countries, they even have legislation and laws that strictly prohibit any sort of form of deception or lying or misleading statements coming from police sort of interview. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting is when we talk about this to the international crowd, people are like, what in the world do you mean that police and investigators can lie? That doesn't seem to make sense. And so we agree with that approach. We found through kind of non-confrontational interviews, rapport-based interviewing, evidence-based interviewing, that when you're transparent and you're honest, that it helps develop some rapport, and it tends to be more reciprocal in the conversation. And so in the last, like I said, about 18 months or so, we've got 5 states, I believe: Illinois, Utah, Oregon, California, and Delaware. I might be missing one, that have all passed legislation that actually bans the use of deception by investigators in an interview. And so just so you know what that means, because I know there's some confusion out there, if I'm interviewing Chris and I tell Chris, we've got your fingerprints on the gun, or we've got video surveillance of you taking money out of that register, and that evidence isn't real or doesn't exist, that with some of this new legislation, that might actually make that confession inadmissible. Most of these laws are specific to juveniles or youthful subjects, but I think it's just something to think about globally. At WZ, we advocate for being honest and being transparent, and we don't want to use deception, not only because it could risk the risk of false confessions, but Chris, I don't know if you've run an interview where if you've maybe lied to a subject or been deceptive, of what that might do to your credibility during the rest of the conversation if they called your bluff. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that comes to my mind right away is if you get caught in that lie. We always talk about, the value, the importance of credibility in your investigation, but more importantly, credibility in you as a person, right? And the importance of rapport building, creating a connection, and then having that credibility. But if you get caught in a lie, man, it's going to damage that. It could be damaging to your reputation moving forward. There's a lot of things. And one of the ways that I even frame it in some of the classes that I teach, on its basic level, we don't want people lying to us. So why would we be lying to them in order to get them to tell us certain things? So even just bringing it down to that level, it's kind of like, what is the issue? The question that comes in, what's the issue about lying about evidence? You could start a list, really, of some concerns and how it can be detrimental to the positive outcome to that conversation and the accuracy of the information that you're getting, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's good. My kind of final takeaway from this is what Chris just mentioned is important from a strategy standpoint. If we're deceptive, what does that do to your credibility? Not only in that interview, but other interviews in the community, or with if you're in the retail space or loss prevention space, what's it do to the other employees that you're going to talk to at some point? So your credibility, I like how Chris said, reputation. Secondly, is we know it can contaminate a confession. So even a true confession, if you're giving up details by lying about evidence or even just revealing any evidence, that can contaminate it. And then lastly, is we know that lying about evidence is one of the leading causes of false confessions, because it actually incentivizes people to confess, right? If I'm interviewing Chris and his whole goal is, how do I get out of the interview? And I tell him, well, we got your DNA, we got fingerprints, we got witnesses. If he's innocent, he believes I'm going to go actually do those things. So there's no risk in confessing. Chris can just say, I did it. Let me get out of the room. Yeah, you're right. I did it. Assuming I have DNA, I have witnesses, I have fingerprints that all hopefully would prove him innocent, only to find out I never had that evidence in the first place. So just something to go back and kind of check ourselves. Be happy to talk more about that if people have questions. I would challenge you to look at the legislation in your state and not just change because the law says to, but change because the best practice says that we should be honest and we shouldn't be using deception. So good question.
Just to add one more quick thing to that, Dave, one of the things that I really like about the new curriculum that we've been doing is even in the private sector, we're introducing lessons learned from false confessions. And even though we may, it may be a somewhat brief conversation at the beginning of class, the fact that we're recognizing that the potential is there and that this could be one of those contributors then even adds to that. And it's actually opened, I think, a lot of people's eyes to why it would be important to be transparent and not lie about evidence during the interview. So, yeah.
That's good. Yeah. Even a well-intended interviewer may not know the risks of using some of these tactics, right, until they're trained differently. I think that's good. I know in the chat, I know we got Mike up from Toronto, up from Canada. So if anybody else, especially from an international audience, you got any thoughts on that or comments about what it's been like kind of in your jurisdiction with that, be curious to hear what you've experienced. And Sonia kind of echoes what you mentioned, Chris. Is that the reputation you want in the industry? So Dave is the best interviewer. He's the best at using deception. Like, what does that say? What does that say for you? So it's good. Next question that came in, and I thought this was interesting, not really as much with curriculum, but more about delivery. In the last, since really COVID, which has been 18 years long or however long this process has been that we've been going through COVID and reduced travel, we've had to maneuver a lot of our training to a virtual environment. And we were doing some of that before. Chris, you've hosted webinars for a long time and kind of remote learning options. We've had some clients that have relied on us being able to teach virtually, and we've done some really cool stuff pre-COVID. What I think is kind of interesting, ironically, right before March 2020, at WZ, we usually have an annual staff meeting. We bring everybody together in person. And January 2020, we kind of decided, let's try to do this on Zoom. Let's see what this Zoom thing is all about. And it happened to be 3 months before COVID hit. And we have been having monthly conference calls. We moved from the conference call onto video calls before COVID hit. So whether that was lucky or complete foresight by all of us, it made us comfortable. But the question that came up, and Chris, I'll let you kind of kick this off because I know you've been doing a lot of this, especially different time zones, is really what's it like kind of teaching virtual? How does this process work that we've gone from, for 20 plus years of you teaching in person to a virtual environment?
Yeah, Dave, from my perspective, as you mentioned, I've been teaching webinars. I don't even know when we started them. It was more than 15 years ago that I've been doing the webinar, instruction for WZ. So we've been in that virtual space for quite some time. For me, what's it like teaching a virtual class? Well, we're now in that space where we have a good mixture of in-person. We have some virtual. I was just out in person last week, and I did a virtual last week. So I did both last week. There's, to me, I actually enjoy virtual classes. One of the reasons that I enjoy the virtual class is it gives people, in my mind, it gives people an opportunity to have a voice that perhaps in a regular class that they don't have. And what I mean by that is there's times in a face-to-face class where you have a question, you have a thought, you're sitting on it because you don't want to interrupt the class or you don't want to interrupt the flow. One of the things that we do within the virtual classes, and I always encourage in the classes that I teach, is use the chat function, use that chat feature. You have a thought, you have a question, you have a comment that you want to share. Well, you have the ability to share it, right? And just typing away gives people, I think, a certain level of interaction that at times isn't achievable within a face-to-face. Do I like the face-to-face? Of course. And yeah, I missed some of that face-to-face interaction. And I'm glad that we have opportunities to get out and be face-to-face with a lot of our, with the attendees and different clients that we're working with. But what is the difference, or what is it like teaching virtual? For me, I get to see everyone. I have eye contact with everyone. I can keep everyone engaged, and I can encourage a lot of interaction. And so I found it to actually be quite a good platform. I do know that clients that I've talked to globally, they've enjoyed the virtual training so much and continue to have good success with our training, even in a virtual platform, that they really have no intentions of going back to face-to-face, which was kind of surprising to me. But I kind of enjoy it. I think it can work. And of course, there's something to be said for, as someone like myself who has been on way too many airplanes through, a couple decades, sometimes it's nice just to walk across the hallway and be here teaching. Right? So there's a benefit to that for sure.
And not have to put pants on if you don't want to.
Exactly.
Be careful standing up. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I agree. I remember when this first happened and we had to transition to virtual, we were nervous because, a lot of you that have gone to our training classes are so used to in-person interaction, and everything we're teaching about communication, a lot of it relied on being in person. And we have learned, I know I at least have reflected a lot on how I can be a better instructor when the venue of instruction is different, when you have to rely on technology and using kind of unique delivery methods to get the same point across. One thing that I know as a team we've gotten better at, and we have obviously instructors like Chris and I, and a wealth of great instructors that we've added a few over the last couple of years, that we hear feedback from our team where they say, hey, you know what, I've been trying to teach this concept. This is how I usually do it in person. How do I do it virtually? And what that's caused us to do from an instructional standpoint, I know a lot of you that are listening are not just interviewers, but you're leaders and you're trainers and you talk to your staff, is we actually looked at, all right, what is the learning objective? What is it that we're trying to get across when we played a video for 5 minutes or we told this story for 5? What is the learning objective? And once we know what that objective was, we figured out what's a better way to execute it with technology. And a lot of people think I don't want to sit in a Zoom call for 2 hours or 2 days or 3 days or whatever. But it's been amazing, at least from my experience. I'm curious what you think, Chris, but how engaged people are, because it's no longer a feeling of like lecturing for 2 hours. It's all right, here's a case example. Instead of playing just a video, we want you guys to mimic us. Here's a case example. We want you to work in breakout rooms. And for 10 minutes, we want you guys to solve the problem and then report back and let's talk. And I hope and feel from when I read every single evaluation from people that go through our training. And one of the most constant things that we hear is how people feel like they're more able to apply the skills better because I feel like they're actually doing it versus just watching it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you bring up something that's important, is the way that we had to kind of think through how do we keep people engaged in this space? How do we give them the tools that they can walk away from a course and feel as though that they can quickly jump into an interview and with confidence be successful within that interview. And so being able to keep people engaged, create not just a lesson plan for us to provide information, but then the application of that information became important. And I think, to your point there, the old in-persons that we would do, we'd share those videos, and it was good to watch videos, see people in action, and as you say, almost kind of like mimic the getting to see it. But I think the opportunities for breakout rooms to actually have people collaborate a little bit more than we have in the past. So putting them in that position for collaboration, talking through the lesson that was just provided, and then providing some feedback and everything. But I found it to actually be quite good. I think one of the better compliments that I had, it just happened recently. I had a class that I had a full day with a group, and at the end, my point of contact at the organization reached out and said, "I can't believe you can keep people engaged for 7 hours while they're staring at their computer." And so it put us in a position to have to learn and be better instructors ultimately, for sure.
And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about our in-person classes. I think it's actually increased the value of those too. So, we're still out there next year. Our 2023 schedule is out. We're back in person more than we have been since COVID started. But it's actually helped increase how we deliver the same points in person too, because it caused us to reevaluate the whole concept. So I think that's all great. I know Sonia made a good comment here. It's allowed more people to attend training that haven't had access before because of the cost, maybe associated with travel and flights and hotels. And so that's been good. And also just a quick shout out to one of our instructors, Amanda. Amanda's been with us now for a couple of years, and a majority of her classes are online, or on Zoom or on Teams or whatever. And we get feedback as a team all the time about how the connection Amanda has developed with her clients in the class, the attendees in the class, and how much they value her stories and her personal input. And the reason I want to kind of acknowledge that specifically is we felt like we're not going to have that same relationship if we're not in person. And Amanda is one of our instructors that's more heavily on virtual, and she's developed those same relationships. So it's cool, and I'm proud to have it be surrounded by a team of instructors that value that, no matter the venue. A quick question that came in from Mike here before I move on. Will the new CFI curriculum have less U.S. case law and more rapport building instruction? That came in through the chat. Great question, Mike. Without giving away everything, I would say yes. One of our goals, and this kind of leads into my next question to Chris, actually, but one of our goals with both the CFI, which the team over at II is leading, and Tony and Emily are great contacts for that, of our kind of CFI 2.0 project. But one of the goals was to make it less US centric, right? And make sure that this applied to a more global audience. And so Tony and team have assembled a group of just incredible, diverse experts, subject matter experts, from psychologists to federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, HR, loss prevention, to figure out what is relevant in today's world for interviewers, and how can we make the CFI a more global exam. And so we're going to be focusing a lot of that exam less on US case law and more on global standards, things like the Mendez principles, the principles of effective interviewing that was released by the United Nations earlier this year. So more of a kind of a global footprint. But that brings me, Chris, to a question with you, and this from Mike's question. Question that came in was specific to kind of international, and you're the guy to ask. But all these changes that WZ's been making, most of it we've been talking about our US audience. but people may not realize the global footprint we have and what kind of global standard we're trying to make and changes as well. So the question, are you making changes outside of the US programs? Sergio says he's got teams in EMEA, the APAC region, and Latin America.
Yeah. Short answer, yeah. And so the idea with the international, I think one of the things that we were able to do through COVID was make this dedicated focus on the evidence-based and making sure that everything that we were teaching was supported through research and widely recognized and other things. And so what that did is that actually captures a bigger international audience. Prior to COVID, for instance, a level 1 training that we would do here in North America, there was a different workbook that we would use in our EMEA classes, and a different workbook that we might have in Southeast Asia, and even one Valverde in Latin America. It had a different level 1 workbook. And part of that was trying to gauge the audience and what was important regionally, what was important to the experience level that was coming into the training classes and everything. Well, with the changes that we made here in North America, that also meant that we were going to be making some changes outside of the US and outside of North America. And the decision that we landed on, and I was behind this all of the way, was to say, let's have a standard level 1. Let's teach the same level 1 class here in North America and here in the States that we're teaching in Europe and in Australia and in the APAC region and one in the Latin American region. So we have it's a level 1 class across the board, regardless of where your attendees are. So when you talk about, Sergio brings a question in here about having teams in other regions, you can be assured that your team that may go through a level 1 class in Europe, even versus a team here in North America, they're going to be getting the same exact content. The great thing is, through the years, those of you that know me, know that I spent some time over in England and lived over there for a while to help grow our branding and our business there. But we've got great trainers. Alan, for any of you that have ever been through any classes in Europe, Alan's just brilliant. So, Juan, of course, down in Latin America, and other business partners that we've been developing in different regions and parts of the world, to provide training. And what that actually ties into part of our previous question about, doing virtual classes. I think one of the things I love about the virtual classes, we actually get people from different parts of the world in the same classroom, which is something that didn't happen too frequently. So you're getting a lot more different input and different perspectives and everything in those classes, which is great. But the changes, outside of the US is creating this consistency and making sure that it's not focused on US law. It's not focused on, let's say, even a US or North American culture as much as it's focused on evidence-based, and which is great focus on what I'm happy with. One of those changes, report-based.
Yeah, I think
seeing that consistency globally for us.
I think it's great. And a shout out to Chris and thank you to Chris, who you can imagine. So right now it's 10:30 his time. But I know Chris has done some virtual programs on just time zones across the country. So he's at 2:00 in the morning teaching a class over here to make sure people can get on. But it is pretty neat. I think that one point you made, it's cool to have so many different cultural kind of norms present on one call, because you can discuss it, right? I know you're speaking this week at the II Midwest chapter on kind of bridging that cultural gap in interviews. And before we go into a region and everybody there's from that region, and now we have the opportunity to have people from differing viewpoints all kind of talk about their experience, which is really neat. For sure. I've got just 2 quick questions, so then we can wrap up and let people kind of have the rest of their Monday here. One, just a quick thing that came in from Robert through the chat. Any chance of bringing back more videos of case studies and online training? They're extremely helpful to observe, which is probably in response to what we were talking about earlier. Good question, Robert. One of a couple obstacles we've had, but I think we have some solutions. One obstacle of playing videos through Zoom is relying on the wonderful bandwidth of both us and the receiver of that video. So the last thing we want to do is play the video and it's buffering on somebody's end, or it's kind of all pixelated, or whatever the problem might be. So that was one issue. The other issue that we had was obviously the privacy of those videos, the confidentiality, because we do like to show videos of real cases. And we, of course, want to protect the reputation of anybody that's within those cases and not have the risk of broadcasting for everyone. So what I know we've worked on, I know Chris has done a lot of this in his classes, is maybe even playing some audio clips that we can, so we can still hear, and that's still available in our online classes. And we've also worked on playing videos, or I've had some classes where we've shared YouTube links of videos so people can go and access it offline, and create more videos like we're doing right now, where there's a library available for people to find after the fact. So to answer your question, yes, we're still trying to integrate that into our program to make it balanced as best we can. I want to put the last question so we can, I know Chris and I, we could probably talk for 8 hours today on this stuff. So I'll just put up this last one, which I know resonates with me. This is back more to kind of an interviewing concept. Lisa says, I get so frustrated when I don't get an admission. Any suggestions on how to handle that emotion? First of all, if you don't get frustrated during an interview, you probably haven't conducted one yet. And even if it's not an interview, right? It's any one-on-one conversation where you're trying to get somebody to tell you something they may not want to tell you. One of the things, I think the simplest answer first, I get so frustrated when I don't get an admission, was the first sentence there, is changing our goal from, if we're walking into an interview where the primary goal is an admission, it causes a whole bunch of problems, a presumption of guilt, whatever, but it's also going to cause frustration. And so if I'm interviewing Chris and my goal is to get him to say, I did it, and maybe I know without a doubt he's guilty, right? I got video and all this kind of stuff. If he says I didn't do it, naturally I'm going to get frustrated because that's my goal. If instead my goal was, how do I obtain as much information as humanly possible? Then even if Chris says I didn't do it, I can transition into a fact gathering interview. Well, tell me more about what you did. Tell me more about that day. Tell me what you mean by that. Tell me what you mean by that. And even if he's going to be deceptive, it's going to force him to give me details and fabricate more. So I leave that interview, even if I don't get the I did it, I can get a statement of his version of events that I can now at least go do something with, versus it ends with a yeah, you did, no, you didn't argument. So that's my first take on it, is try to change the mindset of the goal, which I know is not just on you. I think that was Lisa. It's not just on you. It's also on your boss and your company, your agency culture of what's the goal of an interview. That's my first thought. Chris, what do you think about handling emotions during an interview?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The question, boiling down to a suggestion of handling the emotion, there's nothing wrong with being competitive. There's nothing wrong with, having a goal and trying to accomplish the goal. But I would agree with that. It's if your goal is that, then you might be too narrow-minded into what you're trying to actually accomplish within the conversation. I actually had a group that I worked with recently that said, if the first question your boss asks you when you come out of the interview room is, do you get an admission? Well, shame on them for asking you that question, because then they're putting pressure on you, and that may not be reasonable. But suggestion on handling the emotion, I think the best advice I can give to that is, Lisa, you're not going to win every game you play. Just like the Bills got smoked by the Jets yesterday, they're not gonna win. You're not going to win every game. And so even if you go in with a goal, you have to know that sometimes someone's going to sit in front of you and not want to cooperate, or you're going to realize your investigation was flawed somehow, and the information that you had wasn't what it really thought it was. And so don't focus on having to win every conversation, and maybe that'll kind of mitigate some of the level of frustration and emotions that go along with it. But it's going to happen, and it's okay. But change the goals a little bit. I think I'd agree with you, Dave. Definitely there, Dave.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway. Is I've had plenty of cases where I know that the person was responsible for whatever. There's video, they're smiling at the camera, stealing money, and they still said, screw you. So you're going to have those conversations. And if you don't, there's probably an issue. But I think secondly, like you said, you're not going to win, is redefining what winning is, right? In all the interviews I've done in my career in a variety of different fields I've been in, for some reason, deposit theft cases were always just a thorn in my side. And whenever a client says, hey, we want you to talk about interviewing, and specifically our problem is deposit theft cases, I don't even want to go, because I got like PTSD from those cases. But when I changed the goal, if it was, I needed somebody to say, I did it, I stole the deposit, to what is my strategy? What's my contingency plan? If they say it wasn't me, how do I transition into, okay, then tell me everything that happened on Tuesday. Well, I took the deposit. I usually take it right after work. I take it with a few people and I eventually get to the bank. There's so many words in there. What do you mean by eventually? Tell me more about you usually take it. What happened that night? And my goal changes from I did it to how do I get that person to give me as many details as possible? And I might then go be able to investigate and find out that they were being deceptive, or maybe they were being truthful and there's something else. And so that, to me, the excitement of the interview is, did I get information I didn't know? Right? Did I obtain actionable intelligence? And if we're just doing interviews to confirm what we already think we know, then what's the point of the interview in the first place? So um, good question. It's easy to say, don't get emotional. It's harder to do it. So I respect that. But we're at about 30 minutes or so in. And so we had a lot of great questions, some good discussion. If any of you that are watching this live, or even if you're watching recorded, feel free to share the link with your team. One of the primary goals of doing these calls is to make sure as we're making changes and we're trying to educate people, is we don't want anybody to be left behind. So hopefully these are obviously free and open source for you. So if there's information you find that would be valuable to your team, feel free to share it, spread the word. And then let Chris and I know if you got any follow-up or feedback or questions for the next one. But Chris, thanks for hanging out with me today and giving us some of your insight, and hope you have a good rest of your week.
Yep. Again, my pleasure. And it was good hanging out with you guys. Again, if you got questions, my email address, if you want to shoot something over to me, you can always find me on LinkedIn, but my email address, first initial, last name @w-z. So it is cnorris@w-z.com, just like Dave's is D Thompson @w-z.com. You guys can always catch us on LinkedIn or email us anytime.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks, Chris. I just threw that in the chat.
Yep.
And we'll see you guys all later. Have a great week.
Perfect. Have a great week, guys. Cheers.